Between around 18,000 and 10,000 years ago, the bay as we know it, within the modern-day Bay Area of California, did not exist due to the Last Glacial Maximum. Global sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than they are today. What is now the floor of the bay was a lush interior river valley where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers joined to flow through a dry canyon that is now traversed by the Golden Gate Bridge. The interior river valley then flowed out to a coastline that was 15 to 20 miles further west. This expanse of land was a broad and grassy plain that connected the mainland to what are now the Farallon Islands. Hard evidence of human presence during this time is scarce, but it does not mean humans were not here, as most of the likely sites of human occupation are now submerged under hundreds of feet of water. Scientists think the peoples, whom they refer to as Paleocoastal peoples, inhabited this region during this time by moving along the coast of what is now California in boats. Those of the past who arrived to the region in boats are classified as being part of the Pacific Coast migration model of the settlement of the Americas, as opposed to the land-based migration model through ice-free corridors in Canada. The Paleocoastal peoples would have moved along a kelp highway from Beringia down the Pacific coast. These people were maritime experts, and the river valley that would eventually become the San Francisco Bay Area would have been one of the most attractive stopping points on the entire west coast for freshwater and game. Scientists are certain that if pre-clovis sites have been found in places like Texas or Chile, it is almost certain that the Bay Area has them too, but they are just submerged underwater. Any new archaeological breakthroughs for this time frame of the Bay Area will likely come from underwater archaeology using sonar and submersibles to find ancient hearths on the Farallon Plain. Some scientists like to refer to this region in this time period as a Garden of Eden due to its mild weather and abundant megafauna such as mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths. The valley was a refugium, as it not only had a stabilized climate, but also an abundant amount of fresh water, which almost certainly would have made it a prime target for humans who came upon the area. While much of North America was buried under massive glaciers and experienced extreme glacial cold, coastal California remained a lush paradise teeming with life, with a temperate Mediterranean climate, which is remarkably similar to today. Mammoths, mastodons, camels, and ground sloths all grazed on the lush grassland. The Pacific Ocean acted as a giant heater, which produced mild winters and prevented the deep freezes seen further inland. Fossilized pollen has yielded evidence that redwood forests and oak woodlands existed even during the peak of the Ice Age in this region. Near the Salesforce Transit Center, an archaeological site was found that went 110 feet deep that yielded a mammoth tooth, which gives one the remarkable contrast of megafauna roaming on the site where skyscrapers now stand. The landscape also supported many predators, such as direwolves, saber-toothed cats, and giant short-faced bears. Furthermore, the humans in the region did not just have land animals to eat, as they had a kind of supermarket at sea. The coastal shelf provided incredibly productive kelp forests and tide pools due to stable shorelines. Marine mammals such as seals, sea lions, and sea otters were abundant, all of which provided high-fat food and warm furs for early Paleocoastal peoples. The marshes along the California River were seasonal stopping points for millions of birds, as well as offering eggs and meat. It was a perfect storm of resources. Between around 10,000 and 5,500 years ago, the glaciers melted and sea levels rose rapidly. At around 10,000 years ago, water finally breached its barriers, slowly flooding the valley to form the San Francisco Bay. The megafauna went extinct, and the humans transitioned into a milling culture by focusing on small seeds and tubers. People began using metates, which were large flat or basin-shaped stones, and manos, which were handheld grinding stones, to process small and hard seeds from grasses like sage into flour. As opposed to older time periods defined by elegant arrowheads, milling stone sites are dominated by massive and crude-looking stone tools, hammerstones, and scrapers. With the megafauna gone, the diet of the peoples of the region became highly diversified. Grass seeds were the primary calorie source. This was the precursor to the acorn revolution that would define later California prehistory. Early evidence of acorn and gray pine nut consumption have been found at sites like the Skyrocket site. In archaeological circles, this broader way of life is sometimes called the Encinitas tradition, which stretched from the Bay Area all the way down into Baja California. Perhaps one of the most mysterious objects from this era are the cogged stones, strange stone artifacts shaped like gears or wheels. Their purpose is unknown. Theories range from game pieces, fish net weights, to ceremonial objects. These objects are more commonly found in Southern California, specifically in the Bowers Museum area in Orange County and the Santa Ana River drainage, and they could represent a complex and symbolic world that existed long before the civilizations of the late Holocene. The stones are hand-sized stone discs of around typically 1 to 6 inches in diameter. They feature grooves or indentations, cogs if you will, around the edges, varying in amounts from between 1 to 20 notches. Some have a hole pierced through the center, thus resembling a real gear, while others are solid with flat or concave faces. They are often carved from basaltic scoria, a porous volcanic rock, but examples made of granite, sandstone, and even soft materials like pumice, talc, and red ochre have been found. Scientists have spent over a century studying them and have proposed more than 40 possible uses, but none have thus far been conclusively proven. The mundane or utilitarian camp says that they were fishing weights that were used to sink nets, but some examples are made from materials that are too light or soft for this purpose. Others in this camp say they were used for making rope or cordage, or for crushing nuts or seeds. Others in the same camp say they were used in relay races, where the stones were thrown and chased. The ritual or sacred camp says they may represent cross-sections of the peyote or San Pedro cactus, used in ritual ceremonies. Others in this camp say that they were used as representations of celestial objects, such as of the sun or stars. Still others say that they were symbolic representations of starfish, sea urchins, or shark vertebrae. Bolstering the possible ceremonial importance of the object, scientists have often found them in groups or caches at burial sites, which suggests a high-status funerary purpose. However, many archaeologists now lean toward a symbolic or magico-religious function. They point to the lack of wear, as most cogged stones show no signs of the physical battering or abrasion you would expect from a tool used for grinding or hunting. Carving a gear out of soft pumice or talc makes it near useless for heavy labor, but beautiful for ceremony. Some stones have also been found repaired with asphaltum, or coated in red ochre, which are common traits for sacred objects in ancient California. The most famous location for these cogged stone finds is the Balsa Chica Mesa site in Huntington Beach. Hundreds have been recovered there, including unique matching pairs found in caches, which archaeologists believe may reflect a dualistic worldview. On February 25, 2014, at 8 in the morning, the sky had barely turned light. In a muddy excavation site for the Salesforce Transit Center in San Francisco, 5 stories below street level and 1.8 meters below sea level, an equipment operator deftly maneuvered his skid steer, bathed in powerful electric lights. After 2 years of digging through sand and mud, the geothermal trenching and excavation phase of the Transbay Transit Center project was only days from completion. With rain predicted, the crew was anxious to wrap up when the operator saw something in the mud, which turned out to be a human bone. It was sheer luck the operator was able to see the bone, as a skid steer is a small piece of earth-moving equipment, commonly referred to as a bobcat. It is often used for small residential projects, such as preparing lawns and planting bushes. Most of the earlier excavation for the Transbay project had been done by massive excavators, weighing about 100 tons, which could easily pick up a skid steer in their huge buckets. With no monitor available, the most skilled, sharp-eyed operator would be hard-pressed to spot a human bone from the excavator's cab. However, for the last bit of earth-moving work, the skid steer was just the right tool. The operator had found the skeletal remains, folded into the fetal position, wrapped in woven matting, and buried with wooden tools. The location is separated from the San Francisco Bay by a quarter-mile of skyscrapers perched on reclaimed land, but long ago the burial spot was close to the water's edge. The San Francisco Medical Examiner's Office helped determine that the remains were not just those of an American Indian, but one that they dated back about 7,500 years ago, the oldest human remains ever discovered within the city limits. Carbon-14 analysis of organic matter found near the burial indicated that this young man lived around 7,500 years ago. The adult male had been buried in dense, marshy soil and encased in estuarian clay that squeezed out nearly all the oxygen bacteria needed to live. This anaerobic clay preserved the bone and the associated artifacts almost perfectly. The adult male was wrapped in a large and woven fibrous mat, and fragments of a wooden implement that resemble an atlatl were found near his hand. Numerous wood artifacts were also found surrounding his legs and torso. Very few burials dating to this time have been found, and even fewer have been found with such a high level of preservation. The context in which the burial was found was deeper, older, and wetter than expected. According to city officials, most of the urban area had already been dug up significantly, indicating that the find was incredibly miraculous. The individual represents the potential to trace some of the earliest people to inhabit California, and to make a connection between them and the material culture and traditions that we know from the historic period observations of living natives. The pollen and macrofloral records from the remains indicate evidence of coastal or littoral plants, one of which soaproot also contributed abundantly to the macrofloral record. A wide variety of trees grew in the Bay Area back during the Transbay Man's time, as did shrubbery and herbaceous plants and cool season grasses. Plants that might have been part of this individual's diet include California huckleberry, elderberry, prickly pear cactus, members of the mustard and mint families, manzanita, mustards, and perhaps other plants. It has been theorized that the man's family chose to bury him in his favorite place for hunting duck eggs, collecting oysters, or just sitting and gazing out over the waves, where the setting sun also would have lingered on the East Bay Hills. Scientists think the man must have been of high importance to the group who buried him, as he was wrapped in a woven shroud. Scientists also say that his remains prove that early inhabitants during this time were already highly skilled maritime hunters and gatherers. Secrecy surrounds the ultimate fate of the Transbay Man remains, but the nature of the laws pertaining to the case suggests that he was likely reburied in 2016 at the location of where he was originally found in 2014. This video will cover in depth why the reburial occurred at the end of our chronological narrative of the prehistory of the Bay Area of California. Between around 5,500 and 1,500 years ago, shell mounds began to arise from the landscape. As the bay stabilized around 5,000 years ago, new marshes formed, leading to an explosion of shellfish such as oysters and mussels, providing a reliable food source. People built massive mounds of shells, soil, and ash, some over 30 feet high and 600 feet long, which served as villages, burial sites, and ceremonial centers. The Emeryville shell mound was the largest of the over 425 mounds that once ringed the bay. This is the era and time when the San Francisco Bay Area became a landscape of monuments. The shell mounds were not just trash heaps, but more like pyramids of the Bay Area, massive and multi-generational engineering projects that served as the heartbeat of ancient life. Shell mounds in this region were hills composed of billions of discarded shells, such as those from oysters, mussels, and clams, mixed with charcoal, ash, animal bones, and soil. The animal bones consisted of sea otters, harbor seals, sturgeon, and salmon. The mounds were enormous. The The Emeryville mound was once over 30 feet high and 600 feet long, and they were not accidental piles, as they were deliberately leveled and layered. They served several distinct roles simultaneously. Firstly, they were living sites or villages, as the shells provided excellent drainage and insulation. People built their tule reed houses on the summits. Shell mounds were also primarily burial grounds. The calcium from the shells helped preserve the bones of ancestors. By burying their dead in the mounds they lived on, the peoples of the region maintained a physical connection to their lineage. Large mounds were spaced out roughly every few miles along the shoreline, acting as territorial markers and sites for massive intertribal feasts. At its peak, there were over 425 shell mounds ringing the San Francisco Bay. At night, fires lit atop these mounds would have been visible across the water, serving as prehistoric GPS systems for people navigating the bay in balsa tule boats. Contrary to common modern assumptions, living atop the mounds was arguably the cleanest place to live in the prehistoric Bay Area. The Bay Area marshes were muddy, wet, and prone to flooding. If one lived on the dirt, one's house would be a damp and moldy mess. Shells are porous. When it rained, the water filtered straight through the layers of shell and ash, keeping the surface where people slept bone dry. The shells and wood ash from hearths are alkaline. This high pH level actually helped neutralize odors and break down organic waste much faster than regular soil would. The European black rat also did not arrive until the 1700s on Spanish ships. Pre-contact California had wood rats and mice, but they did not swarm in the urban plague style we now associate with modern cities. These mounds were active villages, with dogs, smoke from constant fires, and a high density of people. Therefore, most small animals stayed at the edges of the mound to avoid being caught or eaten. One of the main groups of people who lived on the mounds were called the Ohlone. Atop the mounds, they lived within tule reed houses. Every house had a central fire. The smoke from these fires did not just cook food, it acted as a constant fumigant. The smoke kept mosquitoes, biting flies, and fleas out of the thatch roofing. To a prehistoric Californian, the shell mound was a symbol of abundance and status. Over time, the surface of a mound was not just raw, jagged shells. It was packed down by thousands of feet into a hard, pavement-like surface. Archaeologists note that a fresh shell mound might have smelled like a salty tidal flat, but the older layers were essentially clean calcium and charcoal. It probably smelled more like old campfire ash than a dumpster. Being 30 feet up caught the bay breeze, which blew away the marsh miasma and kept the village cool. Every major modern city in the Bay Area is built on top of these. Major mounds once existed at West Berkeley, Emeryville, Richmond, and even where the San Francisco Financial District now stands. Sadly, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, shell mounds were treated as free raw material by non-Indian newcomers, and therefore they were leveled to create roadbeds, garden fertilizer, and even chicken feed. Today, almost all of them are paved over by parking lots or shopping malls, such as like the Bay Street Mall in Emeryville. In near tandem with the ascendancy of the shell mounds, the acorn revolution occurred. Around 4,000 years ago, populations shifted toward the acorn as a staple. This required complex processing, such as leaching tannins, which led to the development of sophisticated mortar and pestle technology. Between around 1,500 years ago to 1769 AD is the era when the Ohlone, Coast Miwok, and Patwin peoples were at their most complex and prosperous. If the earlier periods were about survival and adaptation, the Augustine pattern was about sophisticated land management and a global-scale economy using shells as money. While earlier people ate acorns, the Augustine pattern turned it into a science. People lived in permanent villages and built large, elevated granaries to store thousands of pounds of acorns. This surplus allowed for a massive population explosion. You can still see grinding holes in rocks throughout the Bay Area, like at Indian Rock in Berkeley, or Rock City within Mount Diablo State Park. These weren't just for food consumption, they were social hubs where people gathered to work and talk. They perfected the use of specialized baskets and sand basins to filter out bitter tannins with water, turning the nut meat into a sweet, high-calorie flour. The acorn was so calorie-dense and nutritious that it allowed the Bay Area to have one of the highest population densities in pre-contact North America, without ever needing to invent farming, a superfood. Once you leach out the bitter toxic tannins, the remaining acorn flour is incredibly balanced. It is high in healthy, unsaturated fats, similar to olive oil, which provided the concentrated energy needed for the colder Bay Area winters. They contain complex carbs that provide slow-burning energy, unlike the sugar spikes from modern processed grains. They contain all the essential amino acids, making them a complete plant-based protein source. Pound for pound, acorns were often more nutritious than the wheat or corn being grown in Europe or the American Southwest at the time. A single oak tree could produce hundreds of pounds of nuts. A well-managed oak grove was essentially a vertical farm that did not require plowing or irrigation. A superfood is not just about vitamins, it's also about survival. Acorns could be stored in massive elevated granaries for up to 2 years. This created a buffer against drought or lean years, which is what allowed the Ohlone to build large permanent villages on top of shellmounds, rather than constantly roaming around for food. The acorn flour was used to make 3 different food types. One was a thick, creamy porridge, cooked in baskets using red-hot boiling stones. Another was a dense and dark bread baked in earth ovens. And lastly, there was a hard cake that served as a kind of power bar, which were used by traders traveling on balsa boats or those trekking into the hills. The Bay Area also became the Wall Street of ancient California. The inhabitants used the small, purple and white Olivella biplicata shell to create standardized beads. For the first time, we see rich and poor burials. Some people were buried with thousands of beads, indicating a hereditary elite class or chiefdom. One of the biggest myths of any prehistoric region of what is now the United States is that it was a wilderness, but the Bay Area, like any other region, was actually a giant curated garden. Every year, the Ohlone used low-intensity controlled burns to clear the underbrush. This promoted the growth of specific seed-bearing grasses and kept the oak orchards healthy. It also created park-like meadows that attracted deer and elk, making them easier to hunt. During this time, the heavy spear thrower atlatl was largely replaced by the bow and arrow, which was more effective for hunting in the managed woodlands. With more people and stored food wealth came more conflict. Skeletal remains from this era show a higher frequency of perifractures, such as broken arm bones from blocking hits and arrow wounds. This led to complex diplomacy and tribelets. The Bay Area was divided into dozens of small, sovereign nations, each with their own territory, dialect, and leader. The Augustine pattern was a stable, successful way of life for over 1,500 years. It only ended in 1769 AD, when the Spanish Portola expedition crested a hill and saw the Great Estuary for the first time. The prehistory ended, and the mission era began, which would dismantle this entire 1,500-year-old system in just a few decades. The discovery of the Transbay Man remains in February 2014 touched off a strict protocol for how these bodies are buried. First, the county coroner was called in to verify that it was an ancient burial and not a crime scene. As required by California's Native American Historical, Cultural, and Sacred Sites Act, the next call was to the California Native American Heritage Commission, a small agency headed by 7 Native Americans appointed by the California governor. Whenever Native American remains are dug up during the course of a development project, the NAHC is charged with identifying the most likely descendant, or MLD, of the person whose remains were discovered. The MLD, in essence, becomes the representative of the deceased, no matter how old or ancient the remains are. Debbie Treadway, a scientist with the California Native American Commission, said it begins with cultural affiliation, or what we might think of as tribal territory. According to Treadway, the city of San Francisco is culturally affiliated with the Ohlones. Current members of the Ohlone tribe are able to volunteer to put their name on a registry of most likely descendants. Representatives of what is called the MLD list may be chosen to take custody of the remains and decide what will happen to them, despite the wishes of many scientists who would normally want to study such a rare and ancient set of remains without any interference. The regulations are so strict that city officials cannot even comment on the remains without the permission of the MLD, who also controls access to the body. For the Transbay Man discovery, NAHC selected Andrew Galvin as the MLD. Many scientists voice agreement with the MLDs that they would not like it either if someone began messing around with their ancestors who were once resting peacefully in the ground. But at the same time, many voice the concern that some MLDs are not too keen about using science to determine the identity of an ancient individual. Over the next 2 weeks after the discovery of the Transbay Man, Galvin and the project staff agreed on the recommendations for the management and treatment of the remains. The project authority also signed a consulting services agreement to pay Galvin up to $20,000 for his services. The description of those services to this day is confidential, but would typically include monitoring the excavation, taking custody of the remains, and cleaning or other care of the remains. Galvin's recommendations for treatment of the remains were strict. For construction crews, radios, tobacco, and meals were prohibited and cell phone conversations were to be conducted at a peaceful distance from the remains. These restrictions applied equally to any Native American funerary practice, as no drumming, burning of sweetgrass, or other rituals were allowed to be performed, except by the MLD himself. The guidelines also specified that the remains and associated grave goods would be reburied at Galvin's Ohlone Indian Cemetery in Fremont within 1 year of discovery. However, Galvin made it clear that he did not oppose scientific analysis of the remains. In early April 2014, around 2 months after Transbay Man was discovered, meetings were held where it was agreed upon that DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, and isotope analysis would be performed upon the remains. After some funding issues in September 2014, San Francisco city staff obtained the funds from the Federal Department of Transportation. A new contract with Galvin was then drawn up, dated October 1st, 2014. Attached to the contract was the draft press release, the first plan to finally announce to the public the significance of the still entirely secret discovery. However, the contract was never signed, the press release was never issued, and the analysis was never completed, as Galvin was dissatisfied with it, as he found the press release alarming. However, the press still got wind of something and reported on it. But compared to previous finds of extremely ancient human remains from the soils of North America, their reporting on this incident was very sparse and quick, before never returning to the topic again. For months, the Transbay Man remained in a kind of limbo, as it lay in storage arranged by the MLD. Most everyone involved at this point also did not like the idea of making the information of the Transbay Man discovery more public. During this time, they claimed that some people see the remains as being worth money, which they claim can lead to people trying to loot the site. It is because of these reasons that they have said that they do not want the newspapers or the media reporting on it. Nevertheless, numerous scientific studies on the remains surfaced in 2015, indicating that some studies were still conducted despite the deadlock. As of the creation of this video, there is no public record of a specific reburial date or location, a development that differs greatly from other cases of extremely ancient human remains from North America, as for instance, the Anzick and Spirit Cave mummy reburials were highly publicized. However, under California law, if an agreement is not reached, the remains must be reinterred on the property in which they were found, but in a location secure from future disturbance. Incredibly, the Transbay Man was very likely reburied where the Salesforce Transit Center is now. For many Ohlone and other California tribes, the specific spot where an ancestor was originally laid to rest thousands of years ago is considered sacred. Moving them to a different cemetery or location is often seen as a secondary, less ideal option. Tribal representatives often view the spirit of the individual as being tied to that specific ground. Therefore, incredibly, the remains were most likely reburied where they were found in the middle of busy San Francisco. Investigative journalist work done by Peter W. Colby unveiled in early 2016 that the Transbay Joint Powers Authority, a partnership of several government agencies including the city of San Francisco, was responsible for the $4.5 billion project on the site of the old Transbay bus terminal. Incredibly, the authority's 21st floor offices actually overlook the construction site that produced the Salesforce Transit Center. Within their offices, there is also an archaeological exhibit featuring an array of Gold Rush-era glass bottles and ceramic dishes that were found during the Salesforce Transit Center's construction, most likely before the Transbay Man was discovered. There is also a plaque adjacent to this exhibit of a state award for the project's historic preservation measures. However, surprisingly, there is not a single mention of Native Americans or the Transbay Man. According to Colby, the receptionist at the authority's office claimed that though Native American remains were found at the former construction site below her office, they could not talk much about them out of respect for the dead. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed my documentary, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/World Chronicles.